Okay, so imagine you're at the airport, right?
Mhm.
And it's all crazy busy with planes taking off and landing all over the place. Have you ever wondered how they all manage to not, run into each other up there?
It's really a pretty incredible system when you think about it. And just like we have, rules of the road down here for cars, there's a whole set of procedures to keep those planes moving safely and efficiently in the air.
So it's not like pilots are just winging it up there.
Definitely not. There are visual cues, communication between the pilots, and something called the airport traffic pattern.
Airport traffic pattern. Okay, that sounds kind of interesting. What is that exactly?
Well, think of it like an invisible racetrack in the sky around the airport. The pilots, they all follow a rectangular path with specific legs they call downwind, base, and final approach.
All right, I can kind of picture that. But why a rectangle specifically?
Well, it's all about predictability. It helps the pilots maintain a consistent altitude and direction, and that makes their movements more predictable to the other pilots.
So it's like a choreographed dance up there with everyone moving in sync. And what about altitude? Do they fly at different heights within this pattern?
Yeah, so usually they're at 1,000 feet above whatever the airport elevation is.
Gotcha. So it's like having a designated lane on a highway. Everyone knows where to be and what to expect. But I'm guessing things get a little more complicated at airports without control towers, right?
You got it. At those airports, you don't have an air traffic controller guiding the planes from the ground. So it's kind of like a busy intersection without any traffic lights.
Oh, wow. Okay. So how do the pilots handle that? That sounds pretty intense.
Well, it all comes down to something called the see and avoid principle. So pilots are constantly scanning for other aircraft. And then they use their radios on a specific frequency called the CTF, which stands for Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, to announce where they are and what they're doing.
So it's like a giant game of I spy, but with, a lot more at stake.
But even with all these precautions, things can still go wrong. I mean, we've all heard about mid-air collisions. How often do those actually happen? And under what circumstances?
That's a great question. And it might surprise you. Most people think those accidents happen more in bad weather or at night, but that's not actually true. Statistically, they happen more in broad daylight, with good visibility, and at those low altitudes near uncontrolled airports.
Wait, really? That's kind of the opposite of what I would have thought. Why would that be?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive. Yeah. But one reason is the airspace near uncontrolled airports can get super crowded, especially with a lot of smaller aircraft.
Right, so more planes mean a higher chance of someone getting too close.
Exactly. And then you also have to consider, the human element. Sometimes even experienced pilots get complacent in good weather, when they think everything's fine because they can see.
Ah, the dangers of complacency. It's easy to let your guard down when things seem calm. Exactly. And plus, every plane has blind spots, right? Areas where the pilot's view is blocked. So if two planes are coming together from these blind spots, they might not see each other until it's too late.
Okay, that's a scary thought. So even if the weather's perfect, pilots still need to be super careful all the time. But let's get back to those non-towered airports for a second. You mentioned earlier that they have specific entry procedures. Can you explain what that looks like?
Sure. So the preferred method is to approach the traffic pattern at a 45-degree angle to the downwind leg. It's sort of like merging onto a highway, but you're doing it in the sky.
Okay, I like that. Helps me visualize it. But why is that the preferred way?
It comes down to visibility and safety. Approaching from that angle gives the pilots a much clearer view of the whole traffic pattern, so they can see where the other planes are and what they're doing before they join the flow.
Like having a wider view gives them more time to react.
Exactly. And if they can't join right away because there's already traffic there, they just continue their turn away from the downwind leg and fly a safe distance away. And then they can circle back and try again.
So it's a pretty flexible system, lets them adapt to whatever's going on.
Yeah.
But what if a pilot is coming from the opposite side of the airport,
Yeah.
what they call the upwind side? That seems like it'd be trickier.
It can be, but there are safe procedures for that too. One option is to fly over the airport at a higher altitude, at least 500 feet above the traffic pattern altitude, and then come down to join the pattern.
So kind of like taking a detour over a traffic jam before merging in. I like that analogy.
Yeah, and if there are bigger planes at the airport, they might fly even higher, maybe up to 2,000 feet above ground level to make sure there aren't any conflicts.
Wow, that's a lot of vertical separation. But I guess it makes sense, given the size and speed differences between different types of planes.
For sure. And then once they're clear of the pattern, usually about 2 miles out, they can check for traffic and then come down to pattern altitude. And then they turn right to enter at a 45-degree angle to that downwind leg, just like we talked about before.
So basically, no matter where they're coming from, they're trying to approach in a way that gives them the best visibility and minimizes the chance of any surprises, right?
Exactly. But sometimes they can't do that. So there is one other option, especially if the pattern's not too busy. They can enter on what's called a mid-field crosswind leg. So that means they fly across the middle of the airport at pattern altitude, but they have to be really careful to watch for other planes and let everyone know what they're doing on the radio.
So it's a more direct approach, but it sounds like it also needs more attention and communication.
For sure. It's all about the pilot deciding what's the safest option, and that one should only be used if the pattern's not too congested.
Right, so it's about finding a balance between being efficient and being safe.
Yep. Pilots are always trying to find that balance to keep the traffic moving, but keep everyone safe.
It's like a delicate dance, constantly adjusting to what's happening up there.
That's a great way to put it. It's a dance that takes skill and precision, and you really need to understand the rules and procedures to do it right. And that's what we're here to explore. But before we get too deep into the details of that dance, let's talk about situational awareness, which is a really important part of all this. It's not just about following procedures, it's about thinking ahead and being ready for anything.
Situational awareness. Okay, that sounds kind of mysterious. Makes me think of like a spy movie or something. We'll have to talk about that more in just a bit.
So situational awareness, it's really important for safe flying.
Yeah, you mentioned that before the break, and it definitely caught my attention. It kind of sounds like some kind of mental superpower that pilots have.
Well, maybe not a superpower exactly, but it is a really important skill. Basically, it means having a good understanding of what's happening around you all the time when you're flying, like having a mental map of the airspace that's always updating.
So it's more than just seeing the other planes. It's about understanding what's going on around you, right?
Right. It's about knowing where those other planes are, what they're doing, and what they're likely to do next. But it's even more than that. It's also about being aware of things like the weather conditions, the terrain, and even the limits of your own aircraft.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a lot to keep track of, especially when things are busy, like around an airport. How do pilots do that?
Well, it takes a lot of practice, that's for sure. And you got to be constantly paying attention. Pilots use a bunch of different tools and techniques to help them maintain that situational awareness. They're always scanning for other aircraft, both by looking out the window and using their instruments. They're also listening to the radio, paying attention to any instructions they get from air traffic control, and checking their position against their charts and navigation equipment.
So it's like they're conducting an orchestra of information, making sure all the instruments are playing together.
Haha, I like that. And just like a conductor needs to be aware of every musician in the orchestra, a pilot needs to know what's going on with every other aircraft in the airspace.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But what happens if a pilot loses that situational awareness? Could that be dangerous?
Absolutely. That's when things can go wrong. Like if a pilot loses track of another plane or misunderstands what another pilot is going to do or doesn't see a potential conflict coming, then the risk of a collision goes way up.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. It shows why the FAA is always emphasizing situational awareness. It's not just about following the rules, it's about thinking ahead and being ready for anything.
You got it. It's being proactive instead of reactive. And it's a skill that every pilot needs to keep developing and working on, whether they're flying a small plane or a big jetliner.
So what are some things pilots can do to get better at situational awareness?
One of the biggest things is something called active scanning. It's not just glancing around, it's about really looking for other aircraft in a systematic way so you don't miss anything.
So it's like a search and rescue mission, but you're looking for traffic conflicts instead of people.
Yeah, exactly. And pilots also use these things called clearing turns. You've probably seen planes making S-shaped turns right before they land.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that.
Well, that's what those are. They're making sure that there isn't another aircraft hiding in their blind spot before they start the turn. Just being extra careful.
Oh, that makes sense. So we've got visual scanning and clearing turns. Anything else?
Communication is super important too. Pilots are always making radio calls to let everyone know their position, what they're planning to do, and if they see any potential problems.
It's like everyone's giving constant updates on the road so everyone else knows where they are and what they're up to.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. By listening to those radio calls, pilots can get a much better idea of what the traffic is doing around them. And then they can anticipate any problems and adjust what they're doing as needed. It's all about working together to keep everyone safe.
This is so cool. I never realized how much goes into being a good pilot. It's not just about flying the plane. It's about taking in all this information and making decisions all the time.
It definitely is. It can be a demanding job, and it takes a lot of mental flexibility. And don't forget that things like fatigue, distractions, and even getting too comfortable can all affect your situational awareness and make it more likely that you'll make a mistake.
So it's not just about what's happening outside the plane. It's also about what's going on in the pilot's head.
You got it. Situational awareness involves both internal and external factors.
Okay, I think I'm getting a much better grasp of this now. So let's go back to those non-towered airports again. Can you walk us through some of the procedures pilots follow at those airports where they don't have an air traffic controller to help them out?
Sure. Let's start with the way they enter the traffic pattern at a non-towered airport. Like we talked about before, they prefer to come in at a 45-degree angle to the downwind leg, like merging onto a highway, but in the air.
Right, we already discussed how that gives them the best visibility to check out the situation. But why is that so important at airports that don't have a tower?
Well, the big thing to remember is that at those airports, the pilots are basically in charge of managing the traffic themselves. They don't have an air traffic controller telling them when it's safe to enter the pattern or warning them about other planes, so each pilot has to maintain their own clear picture of what's going on in the airspace around them.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So approaching from that angle gives them the best chance of seeing everything and making good decisions. And what if they can't join the pattern right away because there's already traffic?
Well, they have a couple of options. One is to just continue turning away from the downwind leg, fly a safe distance away, and then circle back around to try again. Another option, if the traffic pattern isn't too busy, is to enter on what's called a midfield crosswind leg. Basically, that means they fly across the middle of the airport at the traffic pattern altitude.
Right, we touched on that before.
Yeah.
That seems like a more direct approach, but maybe also a little riskier if there are a lot of planes around.
Yeah, that's true. The pilot has to decide what's the safest thing to do based on the specific situation. And it's really important for them to clearly announce what they're doing over the radio so the other pilots know where they are.
I'm seeing a pattern here.
Mm.
It seems like a lot of this comes down to finding a good balance between efficiency and safety.
Absolutely. Pilots are always trying to do both. Keep the traffic flowing smoothly, but never at the cost of safety.
It's that delicate dance again, always
Yeah.
adjusting to what's happening in the air.
Exactly. And it's a dance that takes skill and precision and a deep understanding of how everything works. And speaking of how things work, let's talk about some of the specific procedures pilots use when they're arriving at a non-towered airport from different directions.
Okay, sounds good. I'm really curious about what they do when they're coming from the upwind side of the airport. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but can we go into more detail?
Sure. Arriving from the upwind side can be a little tricky because you're basically coming in from the back door of the airport. Usually what pilots do in this situation is they fly over the airport at a higher altitude, at least 500 feet above the normal traffic pattern altitude, and then they come down to join the pattern on the downwind leg.
So it's like taking a detour over a traffic jam before merging in. Got it. But why do they have to fly so high? Is it just to stay out of the way of the traffic pattern?
Well, that's part of it, but it also helps them see better. When they're up higher, they have a much clearer view of the traffic pattern and any potential obstacles that might be around.
Oh, okay, so it's all about having that situational awareness again.
Exactly. And if there are bigger planes at the airport, they might even fly higher, maybe up to 2,000 feet above the ground, just to be extra safe.
Yeah, that makes sense. You wouldn't want a little plane getting in the way of a big jet.
Yeah.
So once they're over the airport, what do? Do they just come straight down into the traffic pattern?
Not usually. They typically fly a safe distance away from the airport, usually a couple of miles out, before coming down to the pattern altitude. That gives them time to check out the traffic situation, let everyone know what they're doing on the radio, and make any adjustments they need to.
So it's all about taking it slow and steady, making sure they know what's going on before they join the rest of the traffic.
Yeah.
But what if they can't fly over the airport for some reason? Do they have any other options?
They do. There's one other way they can do it, especially if the traffic pattern isn't too busy. They can enter on a midfield crosswind leg. So that means flying across the middle of the airport at the same altitude as the traffic pattern.
Right, you mentioned that before. It's a more direct way to get in, but it also seems like it could be riskier if there are a lot of other planes around.
You're right, it is. So the pilot has to decide if it's safe or not, depending on what's happening at that moment. And they really need to make sure they tell everyone else what they're doing over the radio so everyone's aware of them.
It's amazing how important communication is in all of this. It's like All the pilots are having a constant conversation, working together to keep everything safe.
It really is. And that's one of the things that makes these non-towered airports so interesting. It's all about the pilots working together and relying on each other to stay aware and avoid any conflicts.
This has been so interesting. I feel like I understand a lot more about how pilots fly, especially at these non-powered airports where they have to do so much of the work themselves.
I agree. And, one of the most fascinating things about non-towered airports is how much the human element is involved. It's not just about technology and rules, it's about judgment, communication, and a shared commitment to safety.
That's a good point. And it really highlights the skill and professionalism of these pilots.
Absolutely.
So we talked earlier about how most mid-air collisions actually happen in good weather during the day and at low altitudes near these uncontrolled airports. That still seems strange to me. Can you explain why that is?
You're right, it does seem a little backward, but there are some good reasons for it. Like we talked about, uncontrolled airports can get really busy, especially with all the smaller aircraft. And when the weather's good, pilots might get a little too confident and think they can see everything.
So we were talking about how most mid-air collisions happen when the weather's good and it's during the day. That still seems strange to me.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of weird, right? But it does make sense when you think about it. Like we were saying before, uncontrolled airports can get really busy, especially with all the smaller planes flying around. And in good weather, pilots might get a little overconfident because they think they can see everything.
Yeah, that's right. The danger of complacency.
Yeah.
But shouldn't good visibility make things safer? I mean, it seems like it should reduce the risk of collisions.
Well, you would think so, but it's not always that simple. Sometimes when pilots are really focused on looking for traffic out the window, they might not be paying as much attention to their instruments or what other pilots are saying on the radio. And you have to remember that all planes have blind spots. So even in perfect weather, two planes could be approaching each other from those blind spots, and the pilots might not see each other until it's too late.
Right. It's like when you're driving and you think it's safe to change lanes because you check your mirrors, but then there's a car in your blind spot.
That's a great way to put it. And here's another thing that makes this whole thing even more interesting. Most mid-air collisions actually happen between planes that are going in the same direction.
Oh, wow. Really? I would have thought that head-on collisions would be more common.
Yeah, you'd think so, but when two planes are coming straight at each other, they're closing in really fast, so it's easier to see them coming and avoid them.
Right. It's like two cars coming to an intersection. They have more time to react than if they're both trying to turn onto the same street.
Exactly. But when planes are going the same way, their relative speed is much slower, so it's harder to see them, especially if they're coming from different altitudes or directions.
Oh, I see. It's like two ships passing in the night.
Mhm.
They could be on a collision course, but neither one knows it until it's too late.
Exactly. That's why that situational awareness is so important, especially when everything seems fine, like when the weather's good and you can see clearly. Pilots need to be extra careful, always checking their surroundings, thinking about what other planes might do, and making sure they're communicating clearly with everyone else.
It just goes to show that being safe when you're flying is something you have to do all the time, not just when the weather's bad or something.
That's right. Getting complacent can be really dangerous no matter what you're doing, but especially when you're flying.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. I really feel like I've learned so much about flying, especially at those non-towered airports, where the pilots have to be so responsible for their own safety.
Me too. And it's amazing how much of all this comes down to human judgment and communication. Even with all the technology and rules we have today, it's still the pilots who have to make the smart decisions and work together to keep everyone safe.
Well said. It really is a testament to the incredible skill and professionalism of pilots everywhere.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks so much for taking us on this journey through the world of airport traffic patterns. I feel like I understand what's going on up there a lot better now.
Glad I could help. Hopefully you'll never have to use this knowledge in a real emergency, but it's always a good idea to know what's going on.
Definitely. As they say, knowledge is power. And speaking of knowledge, I'm sure our listeners are excited to learn even more about the world of aviation in our future episodes. Until then, happy flying, everyone.